a mind and heart that's big enough, open enough to say yes to whatever arises. And if we can actually do that, throwing a welcome mat out to even the most unwanted experiences, this is where you can really accelerate your psychospiritual path.
This episode of Insights at the Edge features Andrew Holecek, friend, author, meditation teacher, and retreat leader. Andrew has a gift for making some of the deepest teachings within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition accessible, understandable practices. He draws out the practices that we can do, and he takes us through them in a friendly way. Practices in the area of dream yoga, sleep yoga, and the art of dying. With Sounds True, Andrew Holecek has written a new book. It's called Reverse Meditation: How to Use Your Pain and Most Difficult Emotions as the Doorway to Inner Freedom. Andrew, welcome.
Tami, it is so great to be with you again. Such a delight to spend some time. Really appreciate it.
I'm going to start with a quote from Reverse Meditation. Great meditators learn to savor hardship rather than avoiding it, because pain provides a heightened opportunity to accelerate the spiritual path. Tell me about that. How can our pain accelerate the spiritual path?
Right. Yeah, good one. Well, think about this for a second. What does growth feel like? I'm really interested in growth and transformation. What brings it about? What catalyzes it? What perhaps retards it? And I can tell you from my experience, I don't grow when I'm fat and happy and sitting in the sun, drinking my margarita on the Yucatan. There's nothing wrong with that. I like it as much as anybody else. But I would suspect that you and many of people listening here might agree that we really grow when we're being stretched. And so when we're being invited and sometimes even pushed out of our comfort zones, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where growth really takes place. And for people that are really interested in psychospiritual development, spiritual elites, and they don't have to be, right? The aspiration is to make these sorts of practices available to us. These are the ones, especially in the tantric or alchemical traditions, that really look forward, savor these moments of hardship, because they can really stretch us out of our comfort zones and into the growth arenas, into the growth zones where transformation really takes place. So there's so much to say about this, but maybe that's a good start.
But I think, Andrew, there's a lot of confusion because at the same time, you hear people say, get involved in meditation because you're in pain. Right. You have a lot of anxiety. You have a lot of stress. You're all caught up in the mind that worries. Meditation's going to help you and it's going to get you out of this distress.
Totally.
And yet now you're talking about growth as this embrace of discomfort. So help me understand this paradox.
Yeah, good one. So, the first thing we need to do is understand that when we talk about meditation, this is a multivalent term, right? It's a little bit like sports. So when we say sports, what are you talking about? There are hundreds of sports. And so in the West, usually when people think about meditation, whether they know it or not, they're probably thinking about mindfulness. Fantastic. It's an amazing practice. But meditation has so much more to offer than mere mindfulness. And just parenthetically here, really mindfulness sedates. It doesn't liberate. And so in a world that's on fire, sedating and chilling out is a really good thing. I'm not dissing that at all. But what I might invite is a larger embrace of the entire meditative curricula, where we can transcend and include something like mindfulness. And so in this particular journey, mindfulness is the platform practice. That's where we start. There has to be some level of so-called pacification, some level of relationship to the contents of our experience using that practice. But then, we're invited to go so much further, so much deeper, where we can, in fact, say yes, a kind of radical acceptance to whatever arises. And so I playfully talk about in this book the cultivation of a kind of industrial strength meditation, right? Industrial strength mind, which is, and also mind, heart, same thing in both Sanskrit and Pali, same word. A mind and heart that's big enough, open enough to say yes to whatever arises. And if we can actually do that, throwing a welcome mat out to even the most unwanted experiences, this is where you can really accelerate your psychospiritual path.
Now, you mentioned mindfulness as a platform practice. And in the introduction of reverse meditation, you start and you say, okay, let's familiarize ourselves with mindfulness, but then let's go to open awareness.
Yeah.
And then we go to reverse meditation, which is what we're going to be talking about. But help our listeners understand the progression.
Sure.
And why the understanding of this progression is important.
Yeah, that's really key, because otherwise, the radical invitation of the reverse meditations are crazy, right? Well, you're asking me to do what? You want me to go directly into my biggest physical pain, my greatest emotional hardship? I don't think so. And so what I attempt to do in this book is create a kind of infrastructure of understanding, the doctrinal basis, drawing on a bunch of the world's wisdom traditions that support this kind of approach. And then most importantly, this book really is it's a kind of a practice manual, or as I write about, it's a kind of repair manual, a way to repair our adverse relationship to unwanted experiences. And so in order to make these reparations and preparations, we start with the basic pacification practice of mindfulness, incredibly important. Without it, forget it. You're not going to do this other stuff. But then you take this, I think, amazing step into the practice of open awareness, which is a remarkably powerful practice that fundamentally allows us to create an atmosphere, a container, a holding environment that is really large and spacious and accommodating. And it fundamentally allows us to rest with a level of equanimity upon whatever arises. And so that practice itself, I spend, I think, 2 chapters on this because it is really key. Developing this attitude. This is a wonderful statement. You may have heard it from a Krishnamurti. I think it's such a great statement. When he was allegedly asked in the latter stages of his life, 70 years of teaching or something, what's the secret to your unflappable contentment? And he said something beautifully disarming. He said, I don't mind what happens. That's an amazing statement. And so the practice of open awareness cultivates it. It is the practice of I don't mind what happens. And so with that in our kind of platform, then we can progress finally into the reverse meditations where we say, okay, I don't mind what happens. Well, let's take this a step further and bring in voluntarily, volitionally on our terms. And this is something where we can talk about the actual practice. How do you work with these things? Bring unwanted experiences, both emotional and physical, into our experience on our terms, and then basically establish this much more open, equanimous relationship to it. And so, these practices are a little bit more, just a little bit more advanced, a little bit more kind of graduate school practices where you have to have, or it's strongly encouraged that we have these preparatory practices underneath us. So that by the time we get to them, and then as we'll discuss, there are 4 stages of the reverse meditations themselves, then we take these baby steps. Then we can actually titrate. We can use on our terms, bring into our experience on our terms, levels of discomfort that we can relate to. And then if we do that on our terms, we become familiar with our relationships to this. I talk so much about contraction. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But if we do that in the practice room, then when we enter the stage of life, we start to perform. And my experience with the really good news and my experience with these practices, personally myself, and then teaching them for quite some time, is they are incorporated quite quickly. I think part of it's because of the rather intense nature of these practices, that they're downloaded into our soma and quite literally embodied and incorporated more quickly. But again, the practice of mindfulness, the practice of open awareness, really important before we step in to the reverse meditations proper.
Andrew, how did you first get introduced to reverse meditation?
Yeah. So I was introduced to them in over 25 years ago in my 3-year retreat, which is a traditional training in the Tibetan Buddhist kind of curriculum. I was locked up in a monastery retreat center in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton in particular. And I, in a set of lofty practices that some listeners may be familiar with, called the Mahamudra teachings. These are considered some of the highest teachings in the Tibetan Buddhist approach. I remember so compellingly when I was doing these practices, it was just a small little riff on reverse meditation. In particular, there, what they did, I remember so clearly, the invitation was to create voluntarily as many thoughts as you possibly could. I mean, make your mind as wild as you possibly can. And I said, whoa, now this is new. This is something I can relate to, right? Okay, so here I go. I finally get to do, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, what I've always wanted to do in meditation, which is just like, wow, let my mind go. And I just found the practice like, this is really interesting. And then I started to explore it and I realized, man, there's like nothing else out there on this topic. Yes, there's what are called charnel ground meditations. Those are somewhat similar. The idea here, and again, it's helpful because there is some further doctrinal and traditional underpinning here. A charnel ground is traditionally a place, as you know, India, Tibet, Nepal, that is archetypally represented as the most unwanted of all locations. So a place where cadavers would be put out, rotting in the sun with hyenas and hawks. I mean, you can just imagine this horrific environment. And great meditation masters, including one of my main teachers, Khenpo Rinpoche, I mean, they would do a lot of meditation in the charnel ground as a way to work with these unwanted circumstances. Today, in the West, something would be perhaps an emergency room or the site of a natural disaster or some accident kind of thing. And so even those are slightly extreme instances, they are traditional practices within the Tibetan Buddhist kind of curriculum. And so it was really in the 3-year retreat that I was introduced to the term, I was introduced to the practice. And then when I came out and started really reading and working and teaching a lot on death and dying, that's when I started to really see these practices. And I started to culturally adapt them a little bit, bring them into the arena of what is arguably the most unwanted experiences in life, old age, sickness, and death. And I can speak with direct personal experience. And that's where my confidence and conviction really comes from. Because even though I've done exhaustive literature analysis and study and also other traditions, my real confidence comes from my intensive exposure and practice to these. And then the experimentation, like, okay, I wonder, geez, let's try it this way, let's try it this way. And so I can speak very specifically about really intense physical, like kidney stones. Is there anything more painful than that? I brought these practices to bear on that, and it radically transformed my relationship. And when my first marriage was falling apart, that's a pretty big heap of hurt. I was able to bring the spirit of these practices into that emotional turmoil. And then I started realizing, wow, in this day and age, when there's so much divisiveness, there's so much contention, there's so much, or contentiousness, there's so much anger and just upheaval taking place. It's like, wow, these practices could really help in this dark age. And so that was the inspiration in trying to share these with others.
I think you're very right about the time that we're in and how useful these practices are now. I noticed when you talked about, we can formally practice them, and we're going to introduce the 4 steps, and people can sort of invoke pain on purpose. I thought to myself, most people, if they're honest, can probably find something in their experience without having to do any special invocation. Right. You briefly used the term contraction. We can find some part of us that perhaps is feeling, I'll use from my own experience and we can talk about it, but like a little anxious about something. And I can sense there's a quality of contraction in that I'm open and it's porous, but there's also some quality of wrinkling all in. So talk a little bit about sort of the everyday contractions that we can bring to reverse meditation. Yeah,
Lordy, now we're starting to get to it. And this again is this also wonderful topic that supports the importance of the practice of open awareness. Because what both mindfulness and open awareness do, but in particular open awareness, is they create successive contrast mediums that allow us to see things that we haven't seen before. So very briefly, the stillness and the stasis of mindfulness meditation creates a contrast medium that allows us to better see the frenetic activity of our minds. And this is why, as a meditation instructor, you probably experienced this yourself, so many beginning meditators say, oh my gosh, meditation's making things worse. I never had so many thoughts before. Yes, you did. You just never saw them. And so these practices bring these unconscious manifestations into the light of consciousness, where now we can start to relate to them instead of from them. And so open awareness does this even further. By inviting our minds and hearts to be so open, we can better see how closed we are. So these practices are simultaneously diagnostic and prescriptive. They will show us how contracted we are, how speedy we are, and then they will provide the antidote. And so therefore, if we have these within us, then we start to become increasingly sensitive and sensitized to things that we never felt and seen before. So in this case, contraction. And so I don't know, 2-3 chapters in the book on contraction. This is a big deal. And again, this has been a marvelous set of revelatory and sometimes painful discoveries over 20 plus years of doing these practices, where I start to look, and I talk about these as the super-contractors. They're the contractors, like, for instance, if you think about anger, you think about fear, or even anxiety. The invitation with open awareness, and then supported really with the reverse meditations, is to take a really close look. And this is not just a kind of a cognitive look. This is a visceral examination. This is a somatic, felt exploration. Notice what you feel in your soma, in your body, when you feel these heightened kind of adverse emotions. And so then what I do is I try to point out these ubiquitous, what I call omnipresent super-contractors, the ones that are really exaggerated in this day and age, right? Anger, fear. Oh my gosh, can you think of anything more contractive? You start to identify them. And then you can start to relate to them. Because if you relate to it that way, you can prevent the reactivity that is no relationship at all. You can replace that with that reactivity with a play on words, responsibility, the ability to respond. But so once you're sensitized to it and literally get a feel for it, then you start to work your way down. And this is where it gets really interesting and really profound, because it's not like they say in the Hindus that, the Hindu tradition, turtles all the way down. It's contractions all the way down. And so once you get a feel for them, then you start to realize the other levels of super-contractors that are taking place every time you're distracted. That's a form of contraction. Every time you complain, that's a form of contraction. And you start to realize, like, whoa, I had no idea I was so contracted. Well, you can't solve a problem you don't even know you had. And this becomes key when you get to the reverse meditations proper, because what actually transforms simple pain into complex suffering is our contraction against it. So if we can establish a relationship to it from these gross, more overt levels to these increasingly subtle, and these, Tami, maybe we can go to this later, they go really subtle and they go really profound, all the way down to what I label the primordial contraction. And I'm just going to posit this out for our listeners, just perhaps, like, what is the primordial contraction? Like, what is he talking about? What does that feel like? Well, if you really take the time and effort to explore through the practice of open awareness, the actual primordial contraction, it feels like me. It feels like the very sense of self. And so if we can work our way down, turtle by turtle, contraction by traction, all the way down into the primordial contraction, whoa, now we're not only liberating ourselves from conventional emotional and physical pain. Now you're able to liberate yourself all the way down to the deepest levels of spirituality. And so this is where we'll talk about later, the fourth stage of the reverse meditations come into play, because they will take you all the way down to this primordial contraction and then replace that with this quality of expansive openness. And that is no small thing. That's actually quite a discovery.